Kia ora everyone, welcome to Coffee with SoFi, session number 7. Like we mentioned in our invite, we're welcoming Karina back from her travels around the country.
Hello.
And this month we'll be talking about how to share some ideas and talk about some stories of success. So let's start with a vision of the future. I initially thought about including some Jetsons here, but I think this is much more futuristic. Despite that, our future definitely has flying cars in it, but what else? It's got a complete shift in how society sees how we interact with the planet and how all the socio-technical systems that we have, how they interact with that. Actions that benefit the climate, they're not just something extra they're nice to have, they're standard practice. And people trying to make these changes, they focus on the collective rather than the individual behaviors. And finally, when people understand that when we talk about individual actions, they're a stepping stone to this greater system change. So that's our utopia that we're going to be considering today. And we're going to be talking in the session about how to engage with people to actually make this meaningful change and what you can do with SoFi to help structure that change. Much of this talk, it actually comes from two people I've been following online for quite a few years now, Dr. Jess Berenson-Shaw and Marianne Elliott. They run a collaborative think tank called The Workshop, and they focus on how to communicate about really tough issues like child poverty and the climate. Last year, they came out with these series of documents about how to talk about these environmental issues in ways that really engage with people, and they produced that for Oxfam, and it's open access. So if you haven't already, I highly recommend reading it, and if you have read it already, we hope that this is a nice little refresher for you and that it acts like a bit of a link to connect its principles with SoFi. So why is talking about this stuff so hard? We're sustainability professionals. We should know this stuff. It's right there at our fingertips, but there are a few reasons for this. We're just swamped with information, and a lot of it's inaccurate or even intentionally misleading, and our brains play tricks on us so we can actually cope with it. Our instinct is to protect what we already know, and cognitive dissonance, that feeling that something's not quite right, it's an odd feeling, like we're wrong. So we default to concrete facts, and that's even if they're inaccurate or overly simplistic. So one of the common misconceptions that we have in our field is that we need to counter all these bad facts with good. You'd have thought that the political landscape over the last 4 years around the world would have kind of put this idea to bed, but it's just not true. You need to bring people on board with compelling stories, compelling narratives instead. But our time and effort is not infinite, and we need to target these narratives effectively. So how are we going to do that? We'll divide people up into 3 camps. Those who are already on board, easy as, but a little caveat, they're not always the best people to test these stories on, because they'll just agree with whatever you say. They'll just be stoked, and if you go with what the people you've got on board are, it might not work with everyone. You've got those people who they're never going to agree with you. They're just never going to join in on our quest for a utopia that we talked about at the start. And getting them convinced, it's often more trouble than it's worth, just because it's so much effort that you need to take. And finally, there are those in the middle, the persuadables. Maybe they don't know enough yet, or they haven't even thought enough about these things to have that firm opinion. And so this is where we should be spending our time and focusing our messages. So what are these messages? There's some key principles for storytelling in ways that bring people along with you. First off, lead with a vision. Start off with a clear idea about the better world that's actually an achievable goal, and give them something to hope for. Second, keep going back to people as doers. They're not just inherently bad. These people are making actions, and maybe these actions are bad, but by the same token, you can make good actions and good decisions in the future. This one's a little bit painful, as I loved the TV show as a kid, but avoid myth busting. It's really actually not that helpful to talk about all the bad things, because for these persuadable people, if you just reinforce these bad messages, even if you're talking about the good ones, they can still be persuaded to the bad. You need to link to just intrinsic human values, and what these are ways that everyone can get together, and they help move away from individualistic motivations and towards a collective movement. We should also sell the cake rather than the ingredients, and this is a little bit of saying from Marianne Elliott and Jess Berenson-Shaw. And instead of leading with all the nitty-gritty technical details, we should talk about how these changes are going to make a real difference to people. The facts, they're necessary, they're useful, and they're a lot of what we deal with day to day, but They're there to support our story and not to lead it. And finally, show people that they're not alone. We're all part of a community. So if we talk about the work that's already going on and make people feel welcome and bring them into the movement, we're going to really do a lot of good. So to put this a slightly different way, we've got a list of things to consider when you're telling an environmental story about how to drive this change. So a little bit like going back to primary with the how to tell a story, but the who, the what, the why, and then some barriers, solutions, and actions. So who are the characters in the story? So what people are in the audience and how do you need to tailor your story to them? Next, again, keep talking about that better future and give people something to hope for. It's not all just doom and gloom. And then those intrinsic values, what make these things matter to people? And if you emphasize the community and that everyone's in this already, you'll bring people along with you. On the other side, what's standing in the way of this? If you use cause and effect chains, so you actually logically play out, here is how all these things work. Explaining these links and talking about them links them to these decisions that get made. Similarly, with solutions, if you relate them directly to the cause of the problem, it works in much the same way. But again, don't get too stuck in the detail, focus on the cake rather than the ingredients. And finally, be clear about how to get to the solution and how that solution actually solves the problem that we're talking about. So we've looked at how to create these compelling and convincing stories. So how does SoFi fit in with this, Katrina?
Okay, so I think SoFi is a really good connector to connect the people who actually can enable change. And it might be the same people who collect the data with the people who then work with the data and analyze the data. So you have a lot of information in SoFi, and making that available to the right people, telling the right story and getting the right people on board that actually then help you to figure out how you can reduce the impacts that you report and collect in SoFi. That's quite an important step. And SoFi helps you to structure that a little bit. So for example, if you are a supermarket, you would figure out what are the main impacts, or where are your main impacts coming from, and that probably quite likely refrigerants and some kind of energy, most likely electricity. So you would like to reduce those emissions and focus on that. So you would like to maybe get people together to come up with some ideas, and you have a lot of ideas, but it's quite often good to really go back to the source of the data and get those people engaged. And as Nathan said, not only get the experts on board, but get a wider group of people, some people that are maybe not so convinced yet, so that you get some critical thoughts on board as well. Tailor the language to them. Bit of a random example is our colleague Florian. Before he joined us, he used to work for a bank, and it was more in the rural community and had to do a lot with farmers. So for his first trip to some of the farms, he got new gumboots from the bank, and he said, I can't show up there with my new gumboots where they have clearly see immediately that I've never been on a farm and have no clue. So he went home. He actually grew up on a farm, got his old gumboots and showed up with those ones. So even in that regard, also kind of try to tailor your language to them. We have a couple of examples here as well that actually in a real life example came up as well. There was a discussion, for example, to put solar cells on a roof. And in general, maybe that sounds like a good idea, especially if you're based in Australia. And so there were people on board who did more building management. They were in the workshop as well. And they actually brought up that solar cells are quite heavy. So to put that on a roof, you need to make sure it's actually stable. And a lot of their old buildings weren't. Another person lived there for quite a while, and then there were a lot of seagulls around. And seagulls were sitting on that building. And there were a lot of excrements as well, which might be not so good for those solar cells. And that example at the end, it was actually the seagulls that decided to not put solar cells on a relatively new building. Some people, might have some ideas to put a door on all the cooling areas in the supermarket. And it's quite simple then to also get from them the information of how much kilowatt hour that would possibly save by doing a test example. And if you get the people engaged at the beginning, they know that this will happen, they will support it, they will help the customers with it. As you said, it's quite important to get people on board to develop, let's say, a carbon reduction plan, or in general a sustainability strategy, and see how you can reduce some of your impacts. And then how can you track that in SoFi? So there are there are several ways. What you can see here is actually a special module in SoFi where you can have your target line, you have your current data and forecast based on your current actions. But then you can add different actions into SoFi that lead to reduction and see how they actually contribute to your target. I know I said this is a separate module to start with. You don't even need that module. You can just really simple have your electricity position as an example, and then set up a new position, a new project in SoFi that captures some of the electricity reduction, let's say from putting the doors on all your cooling areas in your supermarket, and just have that as a negative value. So you can basically type in negative values in SoFi as well, not only positive values, and then we can just by a simple calculation have our current electricity consumption minus the savings that we would get if we implement our new idea, see the results there, and we can see how we're getting closer to our target. So no extra module needed, just 2 new positions to set up, or how many ideas you have, and then just track how your ideas or the ideas of your team, your company can contribute to achieve your target.
As always, we'd like to leave you with a few takeaways from this session. First off, just go beyond this brief introduction and look at some of these reports from the workshop. They'll really help you focus how to communicate effectively with people about these tricky issues. Second, talk to people at the coalface. They're often the ones who know how things work at a day-to-day level, and they're doing a lot of your data collection for SoFi reporting. If you get them on board, they'll have a lot of info to share, like the solar panels, for example. Not much use if they're covered in seagull poop. And then everything will just run a lot smoother as a result. And finally, use some of these graphs in SoFi to drive change. Set up a project to analyze the improvements. Thank you very much. That was the session for this month. We haven't quite decided on next month's session, but we'll be in touch. And we hope you enjoyed this Coffee with SoFi session.
Thanks, enjoy the rest of your day.